Ainz cleared his throat and purposefully swept his gaze over the surroundings. Now that the immediate area around us has been cleared, he said, we can get on with our investigation of your racial class levels. What are racial class levels? The Baroness asked. Gem, you helped work on the aerial transportation network, yes? Have you noted how dragons are termed adult, elder, old and so on? Baroness Saradnik nodded silently in response before turning to face away from him. Did going from talking to a woman in a blindfold and collar to talking to her back count as progress? Those are what are known as age categories, he told her, which are divided into racial class levels that certain beings gain as they mature. Unlike job class levels, it is not something one can learn, it is dependent on your species. Dragons start as wormlings, then grow to become juveniles before reaching the adult stage. Both wormling and juvenile have 10 levels to them, so combined with having at least one level in adult, an adult dragon would be at least level 21. So a dragon that has just become an adult is about as strong as a mithril-ranked adventurer? No, dragon levels are somewhat special, he told her. They are quite powerful compared to almost everything else. Their natural weapons and armor improve, their breath weapons grow more potent and they gain the ability to cast magic innately. This is in addition to their powerful bodies. It takes a balanced team of 5 mithril rank individuals to slay even a small green dragon, presumably an early juvenile, as even juvenile dragons are no longer considered small after a certain point. Do humans have racial class levels as well? They do not. Humans, elves, dwarves and other species that one might consider members of the fair races only have access to job class levels. Demi-humans, heteromorphs and monsters possess racial class levels. The Baroness seemed to pay special attention to what he said about humans not having racial class levels. Ainz watched her from the side, waiting for the noblewoman to voice her thoughts. Is that an advantage, she asked, or a disadvantage? I suppose it depends on what you're trying to do, Ainz answered, holding out his bony palms as if presenting two options. Take a goblin and a human, for instance. Say they're both training to become blacksmiths. With 2 levels in total, the goblin will have the single racial class level in goblin that they were born with, so they can only be a level 1 blacksmith. The human, on the other hand, can be a level 2 blacksmith. As long as they remain equal in level and continue to focus on the same vocation, the goblin blacksmith will always be inferior to the human blacksmith because the goblin has racial class levels taking up a portion of the total levels that they could have invested in blacksmith. The Baroness nodded in understanding, then a worried frown crossed her lips. Does that mean I am no longer pure? She asked. If I have these racial class levels as one of the undead, then it will forever diminish the potential that I once had as a human. Pure, she's worried that her build got messed up? Not necessarily, he told her. It would depend on whether the natural leanings of your racial class levels synergize with your overall build. For instance, my racial class's levels do not diminish my build as an arcane caster because they also qualify as arcane caster levels. Each race has its own leanings, which is why it is important for you to discover your own and consider your path with the new information in mind. I see. Once again, thank you for your kind consideration, Your Majesty. Well, it is not an entirely selfless act. I am curious about some things as well. Now, where did we leave off? We were investigating my account of Nobe's spell leaving me unharmed, the Baroness supplied. Ah, yes, thank you. Now, where did I put that dagger? He withdrew the enchanted adamantite dagger, holding up the weapon between them. We'll be starting small, he told the Baroness. I will be attacking you with this dagger. As you can see, it has a lightning damage enchantment on it. Hold out your palm. Without any visible hesitation, the noblewoman held out her hand. Ainz poked her in the palm, light enough to leave her skin unbroken, but enough to register as an attack. According to his life essence, her health did not change. He glanced over at Shiltir. She has taken no damage, Shiltir informed him, and has been afflicted with no conditions. Well, I suppose that shouldn't be a surprise. He put the dagger away. Nobe is a war wizard specialized in the air element, so if she didn't deal any damage to you, this dagger hardly could. Now, time to make sure. Ainz took 10 steps back and motioned for Shiltir to do the same. I will be casting a lightning spell of the 9th tier. My apologies in advance if you only have high lightning resistance. Be sure to accept the resurrection, if that's the case. He raised his hands, and his voice boomed out as he cast the spell. Triplet maximize magic, call greater thunder. Out of the misty skies above, 3 gigantic bolts of lightning converged on Baroness Saradnik. They coursed through her body, blasting a scorch mark into the ground. As with the dagger, her health did not budge in the slightest. Heinz crossed his arms. He was immune to lightning damage as well, so several notions rose to the forefront of his mind. Well, I guess that's that. It's a good thing you get along with Nobby, the two of you would make an excellent team. We would. Lightning spells tend to pierce through, jump or otherwise deal area of effect damage. If you were tying up a few opponents in the front line, Nobby wouldn't need to worry about damaging an ally, she would simply blast everyone. Your opponents would not be very happy, while you would come out unscathed and ready to finish off anyone that survived. Let's see, are there any other new traits that you or anyone else have observed? The Baroness looked towards Shiltir, who shook her head in return. The noblewoman fell silent for several moments before she came up with something else. Someone noted that my natural weapons counted as supernatural attacks. Supernatural attacks, as in enchanted weaponry? How did you confirm this? The person in question was a dragon, the Baroness said. I accidentally injured her with my elbow. This should mean you have physical damage reduction as well, no? I'm afraid I don't know, Your Majesty. As a rule of thumb, he told her, beings whose natural weaponry are treated as magic weapons will also have the equivalent tier of damage reduction. This also means that beings whose damage reduction requires magic weapons to bypass have natural weapons that are treated as magic weapons. What is required to bypass this damage reduction will be an attack imbued with an equivalent or better tier of enchantment. He paused in his explanation, wondering how much he should cover. Experienced adventurers knew the general principles behind physical damage reduction, but the specifics were obfuscated by the strangely vague way they went about analyzing their own performance and those of their adversaries. It tended to only go as far as this material works on this monster, or this monster needs magic weapons, or skeletons are weak to bludgeoning, but strong against slashing and piercing. They did not understand the true mechanics behind damage reduction. Since she was Shiltir's vassal and by extension one of his own, he decided that it would be better for her to possess a strong working knowledge of combat mechanics. It would do Nazarick no good if someone managing their assets did so through guesswork. Specific damage types and special materials also may be needed to harm those with damage reduction. He started with an example. Low-level vampires, for instance, require a silver weapon to bypass their damage reduction. At a certain level, one requires a magic weapon that also qualifies as a silver weapon. This escalates as the vampire gets stronger, and weapons with higher levels of enchantment that also maintain the properties of a silver weapon are required to bypass their damage reduction. If one or the other are missing, the weapon will function as if it were mundane for the purpose of delivering physical damage. Does that mean no weapon can harm Lady Shiltir? Baroness Saradnik asked. As far as local artifice is concerned, he answered, that is correct. That does not mean weapons that can harm her do not exist, however. Also, if a weapon delivers energy damage, like the one I used just now, physical damage reduction does not stop the lightning damage and one must possess the suitable amount of resistance against lightning to prevent injury. Heinz realized that he hadn't brought any unenchanted weapons with him. He looked around for something to use. His eyes fell upon the Baroness' waist. Allow me to demonstrate. Hand me your dagger, then hold out your palm again. Baroness Saradnik drew her dagger, presenting it to him handle first. Her eyes grew wide as he slowly pushed the blade through the center of her hand. How does it feel, Baroness? The noblewoman's hand flexed around the dagger buried in her palm. It's strange, she said. I have a vague sense that it's there, but there isn't any pain and it doesn't appear to impede my movements. There's no blood at all. The weapon does not qualify to harm you, he told her, so it has not created a real wound. It is simply sticking through your hand to no effect. Let's use a more powerful weapon. That spear you are using will do. The Baroness removed the dagger from her palm and resheathed it, eyeing the spot where it had been buried in her hand for a moment. Reaching into the magical container hanging over her right hip, she produced a spear roughly 2.5 meters long. It didn't show any signs of the recent fight, so it must have been a spare weapon. That will do. Shiltir, stab her with roughly the raw force that a level 15 human fighter is capable of. Level 15, that will be difficult, but I will do my best, in summer. Shiltir held out her palm and the Baroness dropped the haft of her weapon into it. The blade of the spear drifted over the noblewoman's body before jabbing into her arm. The Baroness winced, and blood trickled down her wrist. Before the bright crimson liquid could drip off of her fingers and onto the parched ground, it seemed to take on a life of its own, floating up into the air. The crimson points of Ainz's eyes followed the crimson trickle of blood. It ended up flowing into a bottle in Shiltir's free hand. I can't help but think that this is something that you've done before. It is, the vampire smiled and nodded. It is illegal for subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom to eat fellow subjects, but Baroness Zaradnik has the right to provide allowances between species in her territory with special relationships. She created a bylaw that makes it legal for me to feed on her, so it should be all right? Since she regenerates now, I can get as much as I want as long as I'm patient. How long has this bylaw existed for? It's been in place since summer harvest. She passed the bylaw while she was still human? The NPCs would never willingly go against any of his orders or laws, so it could only mean that the noblewoman had offered herself to Shiltir. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what else was going on between them. After filling the bottle, Shiltir withdrew the spear. The wound on the Baroness' arm closed. Judging by the amount of damage you received, he told her, you should have the lowest tier of damage reduction. This also means your natural weaponry is the equivalent of the lowest tier of enchanted weapons. The amount of damage I received didn't feel like it matched the severity of the blow, Baroness Zaradnik noted. That's because it didn't, Ainz said. Since your spear is mundane and does not qualify to bypass your damage reduction, the amount of damage you receive is reduced by that amount first. These numbers are inexact, but that dagger would at most deal 4 damage to you without any modifiers. Since your damage reduction is 5, it will never harm you. The spear would inflict a maximum of 8, meaning that even with a solid strike, it would be reduced by 5 to result in 3 damage. In this example, taking the full force of a spear would be the equivalent of a human taking a decent hit from a dagger. You do not have to worry about critical hits dealing additional damage, as undead are immune. There are, however, job classes out there that provide damage bonuses for weapon specialization. Raw strength and finesse can also add to the damage of an attack. Ainz thought back on what he told her earlier, deciding to amend what he had said. Back when I spoke of undead taking the same damage whether they received a solid hit or a glancing blow, it was without accounting for damage reduction. In your case, glancing blows and light hits by people around your level using mundane weapons will do no damage. Against unsophisticated opponents, having both damage reduction and regeneration is a decisive advantage. Add to that the tireless nature of the undead. It's a bit of a silly example, but if you were put up against 1,000,000 farmers armed with iron knives, you would win without taking a scratch. I can't say how many weeks it would take for you to get through all of them, however, they'd probably flee after a while and you'd have to chase them all over the place. This is the same for other beings with damage reduction, isn't it? Dragons, for instance. A dragon would be much better at it, he nodded. In addition to not taking any damage, they have strong area of effect attacks and are capable of flight. This is the reason why the nations of races like humans must secure the means necessary to fight beings with all manner of natural advantages. Numbers are only effective if those numbers can harm their target. Some have already done this. For instance, while you may be able to wreak havoc against the levies of Riestais, you would be overwhelmed in a matter of seconds facing an Imperial Legion. It was such an insignificant thing in Yggdrasil, yet so critical in this world. Since demi-humans, heteromorphs and monsters started with all sorts of powerful advantages by virtue of their racial class levels, humans were usually the next closest thing to fodder. The relative inaccessibility and expense of even the most basic magic items made equipping common soldiery was something only accomplished by prosperous and well-run governments. You mentioned something about vampires' natural weaponry and damage reduction improving with levels, the Baroness asked. Will I experience this as well? Since you possess them as a racial trait, it's nearly guaranteed. The specific progression is something you'll have to monitor. At the next tier of damage reduction, that spear will no longer harm you unless it is augmented by skills, abilities or martial arts. Weapons with lesser enchantments will similarly not qualify. The tier after that should be the limit of local capabilities for magic weapons, barring what are considered legendary artifacts or national treasures. I suppose I should learn how to fight with my natural weapons. I would not recommend that, he told her. When it comes to our intelligence on the local populations, we have next to no examples of beings that exceed level 50. More to the point, even those who enter what you consider the realm of heroes are exceedingly rare. The Sorceress Kingdom, on the other hand, can provide equipment that surpasses these limits to those who are worthy of them. Thus, it is better to improve your ability to wield this equipment rather than rely on natural weapons that will only ever be as strong as you are. Provided your racial class levels synergize with your existing build, you should continue to focus on it. Trying to pursue another path at this point would result in, well, build contamination. The Baroness grew visibly distraught at his words, and her head whipped down into a deep bow. Please forgive me, Your Majesty. I was tempted by all the new possibilities that came with what I learned. Why is she begging for forgiveness? Isn't that a bit extreme? There is no need to apologize, he told her. I understand well the excitement that comes with exploring new possibilities. If one does not consider new information, they are blinding themselves and hoping that what they already know is sufficient. You seem to have a good head on your shoulders, so I doubt you'll seriously commit yourself to any distractions from your path. Your servant is humbled by your kind words. Her response was suspiciously close to that of an NPC. Glancing down at the top of her lowered head, Ines was reminded that the Baroness was someone who might see him as a god. In the desolate expanse of the Katza Plains, a lone table stood. It was seemingly crafted from a single piece of obsidian, and upon it was placed a multitude of magical weapons. If an adventurer, worker or Imperial Legionnaire had come across it on one of their many patrols to suppress the undead in the area, their eyes would have lit up in irresistible greed over the priceless trove. The only ones currently in the vicinity of the table, however, were Ines, Shiltia, and Baroness Saradnik. The weapons Ines had ordered crafted did not have quick-swap crystals added to them, so it grew bothersome taking them in and out of his inventory by hand. Annoyed, he cast Create Greater Item to conjure the table and organized everything upon it before continuing with their investigation. So far, the elemental damage tests had not produced any unexpected results. Like many undead, the Baroness was immune to cold. Various debilitating conditions that stemmed from necromantic effects did not work on her. She did not have any additional resistance or weakness against bludgeoning, slashing and piercing damage. She had no improved defenses against ranged attacks and took regular damage against non-elemental energy attacks. With all of the things Ines considered safe to test out of the way, he moved on to the damage types that were generally seen as being effective against the undead. When confronted with an opponent that possesses regeneration, he said, a prepared combatant will seek ways to disable it. How much do you know about this, Saradnik Dono? Trolls can appear on the frontier, she replied, so everyone is taught that fire and acid damage will interfere with their ability to regenerate for a time. I know that certain fiends and elemental creatures possess regeneration, as do vampires. That is as far as my knowledge goes, however, I'm not sure how to stop the regeneration of those others that I mentioned. In this respect, she seemed about as ignorant as most of the local population. Trolls were well known for their regeneration and everyone knew what was needed to stop it. Elemental creatures are fairly straightforward, he told her. Damaging them with their opposing element or separating them from a source of their element will halt their regeneration. For instance, removing a fire mephit from the lava or fire they have placed themselves in will keep them from regenerating. Fiends that regenerate will generally be hampered by the materials that can damage them, so if you have a weapon that bypasses their damage reduction it will also stop their regeneration. As for vampires, Ines glanced over at Shiltia, then reached into his inventory to pull out a clear crystal vial. Holy water is the go-to answer for undead regeneration. The next set of tests will use forms of damage that undead are commonly vulnerable to. Are you ready to begin? The Baroness frowned down at the vial. He couldn't blame her, even if one was undead, one naturally still did not like taking damage. Ines unstopped the vial, and the noblewoman held out her hand. She's around level 15, so even if she takes double damage it should only be about a quarter of her health at most. He carefully tipped the vial over, emptying its contents. The holy water pooled in the Baroness' outstretched palm. Several seconds passed, But nothing happened. There should have been an acid-like reaction when holy water came into contact with the undead. He double-checked her health, which hadn't moved, then turned to look at Shultir, who shook her head in response. "Do you feel anything, Zaradnik Dono?" "My hand is wet." The corner of her lip twitched. After a moment, a pleased expression filled the noblewoman's face. She raised the holy water to her lips and took a sip. "Ridiculous," Shultir said. Unable to tell what the Baroness was thinking, Ainz could only imagine that she was gloating in some way. An undead being that's immune to holy damage? Or possibly. He walked over to the table, picking up a sword that blazed with radiant light. Seeing that he would be interacting with paladins from the Holy Kingdom, he felt that the holy blade would be the most prominent in their eyes. Several rune-like letters were etched onto the blade, and Ainz was quite proud of what he had come up with. The Baroness stared at the weapon as he returned to her. Ainz grinned, holding out the blade. "What do you think?" he asked. "It's like a legendary blade from the Tales of Heroes," she answered. "But won't all that light turn the wielder into a target?" "Perhaps," he smirked, "but wouldn't it also be seen as a beacon of hope?" Despite what he thought would be an inspiring notion, Baroness Zaradnik's dubious look remained. He held the weapon out towards her. Without the relevant proficiency, he could not wield it. "Cut yourself with this blade," Ainz told the Baroness. "Make sure it's a light cut, just in case." She reached out to grasp the hilt of the weapon, holding it over her free hand. As she drew the edge over her palm, she released the weapon with a cry. Blood dripped from a long gash, but it closed shortly afterwards. "So you are not affected by holy water, but holy damage still works fine." Why?" Baroness Zaradnik's voice was a mix of confusion and horror. Ainz looked down to see her eyes brimming with tears. He examined the sword on the ground, wondering if he had accidentally used the wrong data crystals. "Did she take extra damage from that?" he asked. "It didn't look that way, Ainz Summer," Shultir answered. "But why did I take damage at all?" The Baroness' voice was distraught. "Huh? It's holy damage, isn't it? Does that mean that I am no longer acceptable in the eyes of the gods?" No wonder she looked happy when the holy water didn't do anything to her. She thought that her gods still favored her. "Aren't I supposed to be some sort of god to her, too? Why would I express my disapproval in such a roundabout way?" That she could be otherwise rational and level-headed was a strange notion to him. In his mind, religious people tended to be arbitrary, zealous, and prone to both illogical and extreme actions. "Unless it's an attack with specific conditions attached to it," he told her. "Holy damage is simply another element type. Have you not seen a human struck by a holy damage spell?" The Baroness shook her head. That was probably to be expected. Human divine casters usually didn't run around nuking other humans with holy damage spells in this world. "Well, to be clear, humans take full damage from holy element attacks. Between your current undead existence and your former human self, you are not taking any more or less." "Really? Really?" She wiped her eyes, blushing in embarrassment. Ainz returned the holy damage weapon to the table, considering what they had discovered so far. Damage reduction, regeneration, immunity to cold and lightning, turn immunity, normal damage from holy, unaffected by holy water. Cuckoo. Does something amuse you, Ainz Summer? "I believe I've figured it out." "As expected of the Supreme One. What is she?" As suggested by her turn immunity, she had become something that was very annoying. It was to the degree that Ainz became annoyed thinking back to fighting them in Yggdrasil. Except she was on their side, which probably turned it into a massive plus. "Shultir, do you have Pereroncino's encyclopedia on hand?" "Always." She reached into her inventory and produced the thick tome, looking up at him expectantly. "First of all," Ainz said, "I'd like to see your guess as to what Baroness Zaradnik is." Shultir opened the book, reverently leafing through the pages. About 2/3 of the way through, she showed a page to him. "Oh, how long ago did you settle on this one?" "As soon as I discovered she had become undead." "Is there any particular reason? It doesn't seem like you had enough clues to come to this conclusion." "I thought it was just like her to become something like this." The crimson points of Ainz's eyes moved back and forth as he read the entry. Since Pereroncino had deleted his notes from the encyclopedia, all that was left was the basic lore and flavor text that was added when one encountered a new mob. If his notes had still been there, Ainz imagined it would be full of curses and frustration. Rather than systematically determining the Baroness' mechanical traits to narrow down the possibilities, Shiltir had used the mob's flavor text and associated lore to accurately determine her race. To his surprise, as he finished reading through the basic information, Ainz found additional notes written down in elegant cursive. I thought all of the manual entries in this encyclopedia had been deleted. Shiltir piped up, those are mine, aren't you? Since Pereroncino-sama once filled this encyclopedia, I thought I would try and restore some of his work. Ainz looked up to the glittering stars above, the waves of emotion that rose with Shiltir's reply suppressed. Pereroncino-san, it looks like your daughter is following in your footsteps in more ways than one. He continued staring up at the sky, cloaked in bittersweet thoughts. That was until it occurred to him just what most of Pereroncino's notes were probably about, and why he had deleted them. How come you didn't share your suspicions with her? He asked. It was just a guess, aren't you? Shiltir answered. She's one of my vassals, so I didn't want to accidentally mislead her. Humph. I see that you have cultivated your prudence. He rested a bony hand on her head. You've done well, Shiltir. Shiltir's eyes grew wide and her mouth fell open. After a moment, her expression of surprise transformed into a radiant smile. Thank you very much, Ainz-sama. He chuckled softly at her joyful response. Out of the corner of his vision, he saw that the Baroness was smiling as well. It wasn't the smile that nobles would so often wear as a mask, but one of genuine warmth over the happiness of someone that she cared for. If Pereroncino was around, he might have said something along the lines of her affection meter being maxed out, then go on to make all sorts of depraved speculations. After several moments, he lowered his hand and turned back to the table. Let's finish up here, shall we? We'll be confirming what I suspect that you are. Ainz reached over to pull a staff from the table. Greenish acid roiled along its length, yet the droplets that dripped from it disappeared before hitting the ground no matter the distance. The Baroness dutifully held out her hand. You should be immune to this, Ainz said before he touched her with the staff, and it appears that you are. He went through several other elements, finding that she had no resistance against or weakness to any of them. Nodding at the expected results, he took the final weapon in hand. This last one, he told her, you will not ench. Even before he finished speaking, the Baroness' expression turned wary. She stepped back as he presented the flaming weapon. Have you perhaps already taken fire damage? He asked. No, Your Majesty, she answered. I moved before I realized it. Now that I think about it, I've been more cautious than usual around open flames since I changed. An instinct? When it came to his spells, skills, and abilities, Ainz had discovered that he instinctually knew how to use them. He didn't feel any of the strong wariness that the Baroness displayed over his own weaknesses unless he actively thought about them, however. Was this yet another difference between beings from Yggdrasil and those from this world? Shiltir, prepare to heal her just in case there's more damage than expected. This should disable her regeneration, as well. By your command, Ainz-sama. He brought the club down to touch the Baroness' wrist, and her arm exploded into flame. Ainz winced as her wails rose into the night sky. The fire engulfed her head and torso, and the odor of burning flesh filled the air. His life essence spell displayed the loss of a quarter of her health, but her anguished reaction made it seem like so much more. When the flames receded, her skin was charred and blistered, flakes of carbonized flesh fell to expose muscle, bone and organs. She raised the hand that Ainz had struck with the flaming club in front of her, and her one unruined eye widened in horror. With blackened, half-skeletal fingers, she gingerly touched her face, then turned away from him. A twinge of guilt ran through him as he watched her shuddering shoulders. Shall I heal her? Shiltir asked. No, he answered. Her health is stable, so we should find out how long it takes for her regeneration to return. About a dozen seconds after the flames had receded, her health started to tick up again. The Baroness watched in wonderment as flesh was restored over bone and only unblemished skin remained. A half-minute later, she turned back to face them, fully recovered. Her regeneration is a bit over half that of a vampire? And that reaction? Ainz thought about offering an apology for her suffering, but decided that it was better to offer some advice instead. As you've already noted, he told her, pain to the undead is not like pain as a human. Reacting in line with your notions of pain will not stop your enemies from striking you down. As one of the undead, you can fight through debilitating injuries and crippling agony. Your mind will remain clear if you do not allow it to become clouded, and your ability to make decisions and act is not affected. It takes roughly 12 seconds for your regeneration to kick in again, but any additional fire damage that you receive will reset that counter. You must buy time to recover. Use some method to heal yourself or destroy your enemy before they destroy you. He abruptly prodded her with the club again, lighting her aflame. This time, she stood her ground and did not cry out. She did, however, turn away until she regenerated to full again. Much better, Irons nodded. Even being damaged like this is an opportunity for the undead, Zaradnik Dono. The experienced and overconfident will frequently believe that inflicting this sort of damage will elicit a reaction like your first. This will create openings that are often fatal. I understand, Your Majesty. She replied. Still, would using fire resistance items help? Customizing equipment for fire resistance is one way to prevent your weaknesses from being exploited, but know that even the slightest amount of fire damage that manages to get through will disable your regeneration. There also exist classes and spells that can bypass resistances to varying degrees, and an opponent that possesses these is essentially your nemesis. In addition, relying entirely on equipment would be foolish. There is nothing that stops you from stocking up on preventative consumables and recovery items at the same time. Baroness lowered her head. Thank you for your instruction. I am ready to continue. We've covered about as much as we can by casting spells and poking you with various weapons, he told her. I'm fairly certain of what you are now, so all that's left is to explore any new skills and abilities that might have manifested with your racial class levels. Since nothing notable has appeared during all of this testing, it seems safe enough to continue deeper into the plains. It's high time we begin our adventure in earnest. Adventure? Were you told otherwise? Not exactly, Your Majesty. Lady Shiltir mentioned something about your desire to explore the Katsa Plains. Then you disapprove? Ainz leaned forward slightly. The Baroness blushed and hurriedly looked away. It's not my place to say. Do you believe that kings, nobles and others in positions of authority never become curious over anything? Of course not, Your Majesty, she replied. It's just that kings, nobles and those with wealth and authority usually hire others to investigate things for them. So adventurers, workers and such. I wouldn't hire workers, but the Adventurer Guild does train for their expeditions in my domain. Ainz drew himself up, crossing his arms as he spoke. Well, I do not believe that the Adventurer Guild is suited for an expedition of this nature, he told her. Besides, there is no greater adventurer in this land than Ainz Ulgaun. Albert, get off your lazy ass and help us out here. The boss is activating soon and you're making me go over there? Keeping those down is the sustained DPS job. Arg, this again. How many times has the guild wiped on this bitch because you didn't want to help out with the trash? We're already walking on a tightrope here. If I helped out with the trash, I'd have no mana to push through the next phase. Then use wands. Wands for raid mobs? I may as well be tickling them with a feather instead. Besides, you're the one that had us take the faster route and picked up 4 more of these damn things. We wouldn't be behind if we didn't have to keep these extras down. Do you know what time it would be by the time we reached this boss if we went the other way? Some of us have to work early, you know. Sure, now we'll just wipe so you can go to bed early. What a waste of. Ma, calm down, you two, 30 seconds left until. What? One's loose. Isn't that one of yours, Vari? No, I still got mine. One of the dead ones got up again. Our ADPS is too low. Someone stop it, it's going for Nubo. The fuck? How did Nubo get aggro? I got this. Yameko-san, that's not a regular dungeon mob, you know. Yameko down. Nubo down. Taunt it, sis. I'm already tanking 4 of them. Ka, Shagama down tilde. Huh? 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 Yameko-chan was my healer, Tahei tilde. Sorry. Damn it, they're everywhere. Someone do something. Descend, O eldritch energies from beyond the stars, visit upon this world your dark torrent of calamity and flames of despair. Grant Catastro GHK. LOL. Serves you right for spouting those never-ending Cha Unias lines. fuck this raid, and fuck those shitty devs. 15 seconds. You can stop counting, Momonga-san, it's a wipe. How much EXP is left in greed and generosity? We've already sucked that thing dry. Ha well, let's set up groups to grind back our levels tomorrow, I guess. A revenant? The crimson points of Ainz's eyes lit up again, the voices of the past dispelled by one from the present. At the time, frustration was the only thing that filled his mind, but looking back, it was a cherished memory of his friends and Yggdrasil. Ainz nodded. That is my conclusion, based on what we've discovered so far. There are many variants, so continued investigation will be required to determine what sort you are, Saradnik Dono. I see, I will do my best to note anything new, Your Majesty. Baroness Saradnik jogged ahead. When they had set off, she insisted on blazing their trail. The idea that she was a revenant sent their investigation into uncharted territory. It was good that she was so accommodating. Ainz wasn't sure what he would have done if she had pressed him harder for answers. Introduced with the Valkyrie's Downfall expansion, revenants were not a playable race, existing solely as monsters. Though there were exceptions, as a basic rule of thumb, humanoid races were the weakest stat-wise, followed by demi-humans, heteromorphs, then monsters. In addition, how strong a monster was depended on what type of gameplay it was intended for. There were field mobs meant for solo play and mobs for groups and dungeons. Strongest amongst them were those designed for raids, of which world-class enemies stood at the pinnacle. Variants of the Revenant existed at all levels of play. The first thing one would note was that they weren't inherently hostile, but would aggro you if you messed with something that was tied to them. If you killed it, it would get back up after a while. Some regular mobs became a type of Revenant that sought vengeance for their deaths. Regardless of the type, they unerringly tracked down the subjects of their aggression as long as they were still in the same world. It didn't matter if you were out farming materials, in a city, a dungeon or anywhere else. Even teleporting away did not matter, they would catch up to you, eventually. It was a mob that added a distinct flavor to the game, but they became increasingly annoying. As one advanced up the quests and storylines associated with the areas where they existed, one could only let out a resigned sigh at their appearance. When players started to encounter them as raid mobs, they wept tears of blood and cursed the shitty devs. Regeneration, rejuvenation, damage reduction, a solid array of immunities and resistances backed up by an undead stat block, everything about them was designed to eat away at a player's resources and patience. They were so obnoxious that players never called the raid dungeon featuring them by its proper name, they just called it the Revenant Raid. It was jokingly speculated that the raid's final boss was also a Revenant, and she would get up after finally being defeated to start the fight all over again. He would never know the answer. It was a raid that Ainz had never conquered, as their membership declined to the point where they were no longer able to field a proper raid force during that time. After that, they could only grind group content and weaker bosses. Looking ahead to where the Baroness had vanished, Ainz wondered how similar she was to the Revenants in Yggdrasil. Of particular interest to him was the possibility that she might also keep getting up after being killed. Would she lose levels? How long would it take between respawns? What would happen to her equipment? At the least, it would save money. After following her lead southeast for a few hours, Baroness Saradnik came back to speak to them. The ever-present mists of the Katsa Plains swirled around her as she approached. Your Majesty, the ruined tower that was spotted when we flew over the Katsa River is about 30 minutes away. Was there anything out of the ordinary? I didn't try to look inside, the Baroness replied. The undead along the way are loosely uniform to the ones around us in strength. There are no tracks or any other signs of something passing through the area recently. One has to wonder how long these undead have been standing here for. All around them, low-level undead stood perfectly still. Ainz thought it likely that, without anything to attract their attention, they had been standing there since they had spawned. Most were skeletons and zombies, with a sprinkling of ghouls and wights. He had hoped that, as they moved further into the area or approached notable landmarks, the strength and variety of the undead would change. So far, it didn't seem to be the case. Before long, the silhouette of a ruined stone tower could be seen rising above the mists. The building had half collapsed on itself and fragments of its battlements lay strewn around its base. Surrounding it was a cluster of crumbled buildings. They stopped at the edge of the ruins, and Ainz looked around for anything interesting. An old settlement? It looks like an old castle, Your Majesty, the Baroness said. The tower is actually its keep, and you can see where the walls once stood. These other ruins are probably the shops and facilities that serviced the castle and its inhabitants. Is this architecture familiar to you? Not particularly, but certain shops have common features wherever you go. There's something strange about this place, though, I can't quite put my finger on it. Baroness Zaradnik advanced to walk ahead of them again, carefully examining the way. The wooden frames of many of the buildings had disintegrated, leaving dried piles where homes and shops once stood. The noblewoman knelt to pick up a fist-sized fragment, rubbing her thumb against it. This building didn't fall apart with the passing of years, she said, it was burned down. Is that what bothered you about this place? I'm not sure. Our histories say that incessant warfare resulted in this entire region becoming a cursed wasteland, so this location might be a remnant of those conflicts. She set the piece of wood down and moved on. The next building over, she made her way around a group of zombies to look around. This one was burned down too. Perhaps the castle was razed? It's possible. I don't see the remains of any belongings, so it might have been pillaged and destroyed by some raid. As they made their way closer to the ruined keep, the burned wooden buildings were replaced by the remnants of stone structures. Baroness Zaradnik stopped to look for a way into a partially intact shop along a length of half-destroyed wall. This looks like a smithy, she said. Something in here might have survived the fire. Ines wasn't sure how it looked like a smithy. The roof and part of the wall had fallen into the building, and its entrance was filled with piles of stone. Unable to find a way in, the Baroness activated her hairpin and floated down through its caved-in ceiling. Several minutes later, she floated back out again to land before them. What did you find? Ines asked. She withdrew a number of twisted metal objects from her infinite haversack, laying them out on the ground. I don't think this place was pillaged, she said. These are melted weapons and tools. Anyone looting the place would have taken them away as valuables. There are plenty more inside in the same condition. Even the anvil is a blob on its stand. If this is anything to go by, this castle wasn't simply razed, it's more like everything was incinerated. Also, the Baroness looked back up at them hesitantly, then scanned their surroundings. There's nothing in this place so far that identifies anything. No old signs, no letters carved in stone or etched into metal plates. I thought I might find something like that in the smithy, but there's nothing. It's as if someone went out of the way to erase the identity of this castle. This location isn't marked on any map? It is on every version, but none have a name for it. Every version? Riestais, Baharuth and the Slain Theocracy all have their own map of the Katsa Plains, she explained. Each is made in such a way that this region belongs to the country that made the map. The only common thing between them is that the landmarks have no names, not even the abandoned city further down the river. Ines stroked his chin in thought. Did some ancient power seek to erase any record of what was once here? Maybe the cursed wasteland was one of the outcomes of that effort. How reliable are these maps? The Baroness pulled out several large rolls of paper, unfurling them to reveal maps of the Katsa Plains. Ines and Schultier leaned in to look down at them. Each one was nearly identical, save for what she had described. Ines possessed the same maps, but he had simply dismissed their incompleteness as something common to the maps that they had procured for the region. Unless each nation used the same map at one point, there's no reason to suspect any physical inaccuracies with their being so similar. She tapped a diamond marker on the map. This is the castle we're in right now. It's just downriver from southern Corlin County. The next should be around 60 kilometers to the southeast. We'll get there soon enough, Ines said, but we should finish looking around this ruin first. He glanced back down at the map, then ordered the distant Death Warrior captain to sail their vessel further downstream. The Baroness rolled up the maps and put them away before turning to continue leading the way to the keep. Like the smithy, every way inside was similarly blocked, so she flew up to peek down over the edge of the collapsed tower. After a moment, she came back to them with a tentative look. There's a wyvern in the keep, she told them. I think it's undead. The skeletons and zombies around it aren't attacking, at any rate. Have you encountered a wyvern before? Wyverns existed in Yggdrasil, and the reports of the region claimed that there were wyvern-riding tribes that occupied the mountainous region east of the Katsa Plains. The closest he had personally seen of one, however, were some bones that were used in a piece of furniture fashioned by Demiurge. As with many mobs in Yggdrasil, wyverns occupied a wide range of levels with their many variants. Larger wyverns were usually designed for group content. They were something like cousins of dragons, possessing dragon-like features with a few differences. They lacked forearms, using their wings in their place when they were moving around on the ground. They had no breath weapons but possessed a scorpion-like stinger on the end of their tail. Broadly speaking, they were powerful melee combatants with the large health pools, toughness and physical strength associated with dragon-type creatures. Their size gave them substantial reach, and they could snatch up victims to fly off with them or sting them repeatedly as they struggled to break free. The earliest a player fought them was somewhere in the mid-teens. Since there were many parallels between this world and Yggdrasil, he guessed that a plain wyvern should be much the same here. Any differences would stem from mechanics that did not exist in Yggdrasil and the experiences that the creature had accumulated in its existence. Since wyverns possessed about the same level of intelligence as a goblin, it might be possible for one to develop skills or martial arts or be trained in them as pets and mounts. I've only heard accounts of them, Baroness Zaradnik said. The last time a wyvern was encountered and killed was in my lord father's time by one of our patrols. Ho! From what he had seen of Riesti's rural populations, even the weakest wyverns should have wreaked havoc on a territory. Most villagers possessed production-type classes with poor combat potential. While it was true that rangers were fairly common, they were mostly woodsmen who used their skills to hunt and trap beasts for meat, pelts and various materials. They also foraged for food, alchemical herbs and other useful things that could be harvested from nature. Few focused on combat, and their equipment was, unsurprisingly, not suited for battle. In my time here, he said, I've never seen any villagers in Riesti's or Baharuth who could face a wyvern. The only fighting nobles that I've met are Baharuth's great imperial knights and a single adventurer cleric in Riesti's who attained the rank of adamantite. Admittedly, they are all extraordinarily strong by the standards of the region, but at the same time, aristocrats like that are extremely rare. The adamantite cleric should be Lacus Alvain de Laindra, the Baroness said. Leader of the famed Blue Rose. Her uncle, Azuth, is also an adamantite adventurer, so House Aindra must possess a very strong bloodline. As for the great imperial knights, I've heard that they receive titles upon appointment, so I'm uncertain whether it is any sort of noble lineage or tradition that serves as the root of their achievements. In that case, was it your father that killed the wyvern? Or did he lead this patrol to defeat it through a concerted effort? In adventurer terms, what rank were they? My lord father was registered as a gold rank adventurer. Our villagers from back then were trained as rangers and fighters out of necessity to protect our territory from frontier threats. They were anywhere from iron to silver, some of those dedicated to patrolling were probably gold. As for who killed the wyvern, it was my lady mother. When she first came from the south to raise a family, she was registered as a gold rank adventurer like my lord father. All of her time was dedicated to raising us and defending the border, however. According to those who knew her, she was much stronger than that. I see, it seems that you've come from a distinguished lineage as well. The Baroness drew herself up, and a hint of pride traced over her features. I have much to thank for the careful cultivation of my family's bloodlines, as well as the culture and traditions that have been handed down to me. The first Lord Zaradnik was an adamantite adventurer, and while his descendants have so far not been able to match him, it appears that I may. Well, Zaradnik Dono, Ein smiled, in that case, how would you like to replicate your mother's achievement? There's a wyvern in there waiting to be defeated.